Okay, so now we're going to talk about respiratory physiology. And like I mentioned earlier, the primary function of the respiratory system is to supply the body with oxygen and dispose of carbon dioxide. And to make this happen, four things need to occur. And these are these four things right here, which are all illustrated on this diagram. The first thing that has to happen is called pulmonary ventilation, or simply breathing. Okay, this is the rhythmic cycle of inhaling and exhaling, and the goal here is to move air into and out of the lungs so we can exchange gases there. So it's the movement of air into and out of the lungs. The next step that we have to that we're going to talk about is alveolar gas exchange. So once we move that air into the lungs, then we want to exchange gases with that air, and that happens at the alveoli, between the air and the blood, between the blood and the alveoli. So that's the second thing that needs to happen. Third thing, after those gases get into the blood, then those gases need to be transported through the blood, through the cardiovascular system to the places they need to go. So we'll talk about that as well. And then the last thing that needs to happen is something called systemic gas exchange. So we just talked about alveolar gas exchange, then those gases go into the blood. Well, then those gases, in particular oxygen, are taken to the systemic tissues, to the cells of the body. And we need to drop off that oxygen to the cells of the body. At the same time, we need to pick up carbon dioxide. We need to pick up carbon dioxide and take that back to the lungs. All right, so we're going to spend the first part here talking about pulmonary ventilation, or breathing. And like I said, pulmonary ventilation is the movement of air into and out of the lungs so we can exchange gases there. So what happens is that during inspiration, air is going to flow into the lungs. And then during expiration or exhaling, air is going to flow out of the lungs. And one complete breath is called a respiratory cycle there. And again, what we're doing is we're moving air down into these alveoli, and then so that air moves into the alveoli, then that air moves out of the alveoli. These are dead ends here. Okay, there's no going any other place. And so the air comes down here during inspiration, it circulates around, and then it goes out during expiration. And this is called ventilation. Okay, the reason it's called pulmonary ventilation, ventilation means causing air to circulate freely. And so that air is moving down into the alveoli during inspiration, and it circulates freely in the alveoli, and then it moves out during expiration. And all of that is pulmonary ventilation, or breathing. Why are we doing it? So gases can be exchanged at the alveoli. All right, there's lots of different types of breathing patterns. The one that we're going to talk about a few of these under different situations, but the one we should start with is called eupnea. This is your normal breathing pattern, your normal breathing rate and your normal breathing pattern, your unconscious breathing rate, your unconscious breathing pattern. Okay, so there's eupnea, but then we can also have an increased respiratory rate, which is called tachypnea. All right, then we can have a decreased respiratory rate, which is bradypnea, or something pronounced to that effect. And then an absence of breathing is apnea. So we can match all of those different breathing scenarios to these situations right here. Which one is eupnea? Which one is your normal breathing pattern, your unconscious breathing pattern? That's going on right there. What about tachypnea? Increased respiratory rate. We'll put that in blue. There we go. What about bradypnea? Decreased respiratory rate. That's occurring right there. And what about apnea, the absence of breathing? That's no good, right? That's going on right there. Okay, but back to eupnea for now. So eupnea is what we call our normal, quiet breathing. It's unconscious. It's involuntary. We don't think about it. And when eupnea is driving respiratory rate, we breathe at about 12 to 20 breaths per minute. That's our normal unconscious breathing rate. And what happens there is that inspiration lasts about 2 seconds, which is followed by expiration, lasts about 3 seconds. So each breath takes a total of about 5 seconds. And so that gives us about 12 to 20 breaths per minute. So where is this coming from? Where are these commands coming from that's going to drive eupnea? And the answer there is in the brainstem, specifically in the medulla oblongata. Okay, we have respiratory centers in the medulla oblongata that are going to drive eupnea, drive this unconscious respiratory rate. And something I want to point out is that these respiratory centers up here in the medulla, they control breathing by controlling the contraction of and relaxation of what we call respiratory muscles. And these are some respiratory muscles right there. These respiratory muscles, they're skeletal muscles, and they're going to be involved in, or they're going to be responsible for inhaling and exhaling. And we'll look at those respiratory muscles on the next slide. But basically, neurons come down, motor neurons come down out of the respiratory center. They're going to cause these muscles to contract, which is going to generate our breathing. Okay, so a little physics here, and this just has to do with the movement of airflow into and out of the lungs, and the same factors that drive the movement of blood through the cardiovascular system are going to drive the movement of air through the respiratory system, and that has to do with pressure differences. Gases move from an area of higher pressure to lower pressure. Okay, just like fluids move from an area of higher pressure to lower pressure. The same goes with gases. So what happens is that during inspiration, the volume of the lung expands. Okay, the thoracic cage expands, the lungs expand, and that's what this is supposed to illustrate right there. You go from a certain volume, the lungs expand, and now you have a larger volume. Well, what does this do to air pressure in the lungs over here? Air pressure, when you increase volume, goes down. And that's what this illustrates right here. Right here. This is atmospheric pressure. The pressure in the atmosphere out here, which is 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level. Well, when the lungs expand and the pressure goes down, that drops the pressure inside the lungs to 757 millimeters of mercury. So not a large difference at all, but it is a difference. And so specifically, pressure is higher outside the lungs than inside, and that allows air to move in the lungs. So the lungs expand, pressure drops, and that allows air to move in the lungs. Then what happens when you exhale? During expiration, the lungs recoil. Okay, there's elasticity in there. There's elastic fibers in there. And so when those muscles are done contracting, the lungs recoil, the volume goes down, and what does that do to pressure? That causes pressure to go up. And so now you have the pressure in the lungs is 763, which is greater than outside, and that causes air to move out of the lungs. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, it is these respiratory muscles that are going to be in charge of actually changing the volume of the lungs. Okay, so air is going to move into and out of the lungs because of the contraction and relaxation of these respiratory muscles, which are skeletal muscles. And the primary respiratory muscles, the primary one is the diaphragm, but we also have the intercostals, the skeletal muscles that we find in between the ribs here. And basically what's going to happen is when these respiratory muscles contract, the volume of the thoracic cage and the volume of the thoracic cage and the lungs along with them is going to change. And when lung volume changes, gas pressure changes, and gas pressure changes drives airflow. So take-home messages: respiratory muscles, or the contraction and relaxation of these respiratory muscles, is going to cause volume and pressure changes in the lungs. And these volume and pressure changes are going to cause the movement of air into and out of the lungs. I do want to say that out of these respiratory muscles, the diaphragm is the main respiratory muscle. During eupnea, 2/3 of airflow into and out of the lungs is due to the contraction and relaxation of the diaphragm alone. Yeah, by the way, the diaphragm is this kind of odd dome-shaped muscle. It's like a parachute that separates the thoracic cavities from the abdominal cavity. Okay, let's look at the specific events that happens here. So we'll start with inspiration. And during inspiration, the diaphragm contracts. And here's the diaphragm here. And when the diaphragm contracts, what happens is it actually flattens out. So normally, the diaphragm is kind of up there, more so in the thoracic cavity. But when the diaphragm contracts, the diaphragm flattens out and moves down. And what that does is it increases the size of the thoracic cavity, of the thoracic cage. And when the thoracic cage expands, the lungs expand along with it. Okay? So we're increasing the volume of the lungs. At the same time, we have the intercostal muscles that are contracting. And when that happens, that lifts up the rib cage and it swings the sternum out anteriorly. So we're increasing the size of the thoracic cage in the anterior and posterior direction. In both of these with both of these respiratory muscles, though, essentially what we're doing when the diaphragm contracts and when the intercostal contracts is we're increasing the dimensions of the thoracic cage. And when the thoracic cage expands, the lungs expand along with it. And when the lungs expand, that increases the volume, and that drops the pressure inside the lungs and causes air to move inside. So let's go through that again. Here's the diaphragm in its normal position up there. Then it contracts and it moves down. The intercostals contract, and that increases the size of the thoracic cage along with it. When the thoracic cage expands, so do the lungs. So now we have increased volume of the lungs. And when you have an increased volume, you have a decreased pressure. And that's what we're looking at right here. So when the respiratory muscles contract, pressure drops to 757, and that allows air to move from the atmosphere into the lungs. Okay, so simply by contracting the respiratory muscles, we change the pressure, and that allows air to move down its pressure gradient into the lungs. Now, just the opposite happens during expiration or exhaling. And by the way, this is a passive process. What I mean by that is it happens because the respiratory muscles relax. So they just contracted, you inhaled, and now they relax. And when they relax, the thoracic cage and the lungs recoil. They decrease in volume. What does that do to pressure? That increases pressure. And specifically, it increases it to 763. So what does that do? That causes air to move out of the lungs. So simply by the contraction and relaxation of these respiratory muscles, we're causing air to move into the lungs and out of the lungs. Okay, so here we have two situations. One is during inspiration, one is during expiration. And I guess I should ask you first of all, which one is Which one is inspiration? Which one is inhaling? And what you want to look for inspiration, you want to look for the largest lung volume. Okay, and which one is that happening in? Right there. So what's happening in this situation? In this situation, the diaphragm contracts, and so it flattens out. And so you can see that the lungs have a larger size when the diaphragm contracts. That decreases pressure, air moves in. Then what about this situation over here? Well, that means this situation over here is expiration. And here you can see that the diaphragm is relaxed. And when the diaphragm is relaxed, it's basically pushed further up into the thoracic cavity. Okay, so that decreases the volume of the lungs, increases pressure, and that allows air to move out of the lungs. Now, we're not always breathing with eupnea, and sometimes we can voluntarily change our breathing, I guess is what I'm getting at. And two other breathing situations here are a situation of deep inspiration. You can take a deep breath, or you can do something called forced expiration, which is forcefully expelling air from the lungs. And you can consciously do both of these. My point here is that when you do this, there's other respiratory muscles involved. Okay, so during deep inspiration, for instance, the back muscles are involved, along with the sternocleidomastoid, the scalenes, and some of the pectoralis muscles. These are all involved in deep inspiration. And then forced expiration, and this is one that I'd like you guys to know. During forced expiration here, okay, how do we forcefully exhale air? Well, that involves the abdominal muscles, and in particular the rectus abdominis. And what it does is when you contract the rectus abdominis, it further decreases the volume of the lungs and increases the pressure, which causes air to move out more forcefully. We're not going to talk about this chart much, but I just want to use it to illustrate a point. So first of all, this is we're measuring something here. This is time on the x-axis, and here we're looking at volume, air volume. And so what this is the volume of air moving into and out of the lungs, and this is called spirometry. You can measure this, and you can use it to diagnose different respiratory problems. But two things that I want to point out here that you do need to know are something called respiratory rate and respiratory depth. Respiratory rate refers to the number of breaths per minute. So there's a breath, there's a breath, there's a breath, there's a breath. Okay, so respiratory rate refers to the number of breaths per minute. Respiratory depth refers to the volume of the breath, how much air moves into and out of the lungs with each breath. So while you're measuring rate by the number of breaths here, you're measuring respiratory depth by the amount of air that's moving into the lungs and out of the lungs. Okay, so here's a specific respiratory depth, but you can see that changes. Okay, air moving into the lungs, air moving out of the lungs. So both of these represent different respiratory depths. Okay. So those are two things that we can change. We can change respiratory rate, respiratory depth. And what both of these do is they change the amount of pulmonary ventilation, the amount of air moving into and out of the lungs. So So yeah, how can we do that? Okay, what if we want to alter pulmonary ventilation? We always don't want to breathe at the same rate. There's situations where we need to breathe faster or slower and all that kind of stuff. So how can we change pulmonary ventilation? How can we alter the amount of air reaching the lungs? Well, just as you suspect, we can constrict or we can dilate the bronchioles. Okay, and what's going to be in charge of doing that? No surprise, the nervous system, and specifically the autonomic nervous system. Now, what about dilating the airway, bronchodilation? When do we want to do that? How about during fight or flight, the sympathetic response? Okay, we want more air moving into the and out of the lungs because we need to exchange the gases there. How's that going to happen? Well, here's the sympathetic system on this side out of the thoracic thoracic and lumbar region, and you can see that these sympathetic fibers go to the lungs, and what are they doing? Well, they're acting on that smooth muscle that's around the bronchioles, and they're releasing it. Okay, and that's allowing the bronchioles to dilate. What about bronchoconstriction? When do we want that to occur? Well, how about during rest and digest, the parasympathetic system? So what happens there is the parasympathetic system comes in and it causes that smooth muscle to constrict, and that causes the lumen of the bronchioles to decrease, and so that's how we can bronchoconstrict our airways. Okay, so this is one way that we can alter pulmonary ventilation. Specifically, we can increase pulmonary ventilation or decrease pulmonary ventilation simply by bronchoconstriction or bronchodilation. But what's another way we can do that? What's another way we can alter pulmonary ventilation? And the answer is we can change both our respiratory rate and our respiratory depth. Okay, and our body does this in response to CO2. So during exercise, what's happening? Skeletal muscles they need more ATP. Okay, so we need to increase the rate of cellular respiration, which is great. That's what we need to do, but as you guys know, CO2 is a byproduct of that. And when too much CO2 builds up in the body, the pH goes down. The body becomes acidic. And so that's a problem. All right, so we have, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, we have chemoreceptors in the brain and in the blood vessels that detect this increase in CO2. What happens next? This information is taken to the brain and specifically to the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata says, all right, or it detects this rise in CO2 and it knows that we need to get rid of this CO2. Okay, we need to exhale that CO2 out to get rid of it. How are we going to do that at a higher rate that we're normally doing? Well, those respiratory centers are going to be activated and they're going to fire on those respiratory muscles at an increased rate. Okay, so by firing on those respiratory muscles more frequently, then what that does is it increases our respiratory rate. And when we increase our respiratory rate, we're increasing our ventilation, which means that we're exhaling more CO2, and that brings CO2 back down to where we need it to be. Another thing that I want to point out here that affects pulmonary ventilation, and that's pulmonary compliance. This is the ease at which the lungs expand. So my question to you guys, first off, is pulmonary compliance good? Do you want high pulmonary compliance? And the answer is yes. Okay, you want your lungs to expand and recoil with ease. It means they're working normally. It means the elasticity in the lungs are working as it should. Okay, so what structural feature in the walls of the respiratory tract enable pulmonary compliance? Those are those elastic fibers. Okay, and these elastic fibers can get damaged. Okay, lung disease, particles that get into the lung, tuberculosis and all that stuff, that can stiffen the lungs. It can reduce that elasticity. And so what happens, by the way, this is a healthy tissue from a lung. This is healthy tissue from a 90-year-old school teacher. And this is from a 40-year-old miner that's been in the mines, and inhaled all of these particles. And what that does is it stiffens up the lungs. It causes scar tissue to form. So this is fibrosis. And what happens? Well, pulmonary, when that happens, the lungs can't expand and recoil as they should, and so the pulmonary compliance goes down, and it makes it much harder to breathe, and that decreases your ventilation, results in difficulty breathing. All right, so everything we talked about there has to do with pulmonary ventilation. The next thing I want to talk about, the next step, the second step in that process, the respiratory physiology, is alveolar gas exchange. So pulmonary ventilation, what are we doing with that? We're moving air into the alveoli. A different color. With pulmonary ventilation, we're moving air into the alveoli and out of the alveoli. Why are we doing that? So we can exchange gases at the level of the alveoli. And specifically, we're going to exchange gases between the air, between the alveoli, and between this dense capillary bed that wraps around all of these alveoli. So we're going to exchange air between the alveoli and the capillaries that are on top of those, and specifically those are the pulmonary capillaries on top of those. And like I had mentioned earlier, the walls of the alveoli and the walls of the capillaries form what's called a respiratory membrane, and this is the membrane that those gases are going to be exchanged across. And this is kind of illustrating that here. Here we have, use the right colors. So first of all of this is pulmonary capillary right there. These are pulmonary capillaries that are wrapped around an alveoli. And these are red blood cells that are entering the pulmonary capillary. Why are they blue? They're blue because they have low oxygen and high CO2. So they enter the pulmonary capillary, and what do? They drop off carbon dioxide. At the same time, they take up oxygen. Okay, so that happens at the first part of the pulmonary capillary. And then, so what that means is that the red blood cells that leave the pulmonary capillaries, they came in with high CO2, now they have low CO2. They came in with low oxygen, now they have high oxygen. Okay, so that's basically the process there. That's alveolar gas exchange. We drop off CO2 and we pick up oxygen, and then this blood can return to the left side of the heart and be distributed to the systemic circulation. So here we're looking at an alveoli, and here's a pulmonary capillary, and this is the respiratory membrane that those gases are going to be exchanged across. So now we're looking at a close-up of this. Here's the wall of the capillary, right there. Here's the wall of the alveoli, right there, and then they share some common structure in there. So all that's the respiratory membrane, and you can see gases moving across. Something I want to point out, though, is in the alveoli here. The alveoli, inside the alveoli, is a thin layer of water. So all of the alveoli are lined by a thin layer of water. And the bottom line is that this water is required for gas exchange across the membrane. If we didn't have that water there, then these gases wouldn't be able to be exchanged across. All right, it's a physics thing, and we're just going to leave it at that. But the water is required for gas exchange, so that's why it's there. But this film of water creates a problem, okay? And the reason is because these water molecules are attracted to each other. Okay, they have hydrogen bonds that attract water molecules to each other, and that creates surface tension. And that creates a problem for pulmonary ventilation, because specifically during pulmonary ventilation, these alveoli need to expand. They need to increase their volume. Okay? And those respiratory muscles are pulling on the alveoli, or respiratory muscles pull on connective tissue, the connective tissue pulls in on the alveoli to increase the volume here. Now, what problem does that present? What problem does this water present? Well, there's surface tension there, and so the water, it doesn't want to be pulled apart. And so that makes this expanding of the alveoli much more difficult, because you have to break these bonds in order for the alveoli to expand. Okay, and that's a problem. It's not an efficient means of pulmonary ventilation. So does the body have a solution to this? How do we do this? We need this water here for gas exchange, but at the same time, it's making it really hard for us to breathe because we can't expand our lungs as easy. Does anybody know the solution to that? The solution to that is a molecule called surfactant. And this is basically a soap molecule. So here we have the alveoli, and here's our layer of water, and you have these cells close by that are actually going to produce this surfactant molecule, and they're going to release this surfactant molecule into the water there. And that's what this is illustrating right here. This is a surfactant molecule, and what these surfactant molecules do is they break the hydrogen bonds between the individual water molecules. Okay. So what does that mean? It means we're still able to have water in the lungs, which we want a little bit for gas exchange, but the surfactant is breaking those bonds, and that allows the alveoli to expand as they should without that added difficulty. So surfactant is our solution to that. Now there's something related to this called infant respiratory distress syndrome, and this occurs in premature babies. And basically what happens is they have too little surfactant present. Okay, there's not enough surfactant, so what that means is that the water causes those alveoli to basically collapse on themselves. And now every time this poor little baby wants to breathe, it has to fully inflate his or her lungs to do that, and that takes a lot of effort. Okay, and so it's really hard for this little infant here to breathe. So what do we do? What are they doing here? They have this solution, and they're sticking that solution down into the trachea. Ultimately, what are they doing? Where they're spraying surfactant down into there, because that surfactant, the respiratory tract is an open body cavity. It goes down into the lungs, eventually gets into the alveoli, and makes its way into that water there, and that allows those hydrogen bonds to be broken. And so we just simply spray that natural or synthetic surfactant into the newborn's respiratory passageways. And the idea is that once the baby's body develops a little more, then the lungs can do that on their own. Okay, so this is where we left off here with alveolar gas exchange. And basically what we're doing with alveolar gas exchange is we're exchanging gases between the air in the alveoli and the blood. And the specific blood vessels we're exchanging gases with are the pulmonary capillaries. Okay. So let's look at the movement of these gases here. Specifically, we're looking at the movement of two gases, of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And what do we know about the movement of these gases? What's going to determine which way these gases move? Well, gases, just like liquids, move from an area of higher to lower pressure. And another way we say that is they diffuse down their pressure gradients from an area of higher to lower pressure. So oxygen is going to move from an area of higher pressure to lower pressure, as is carbon dioxide. So what I want you guys to be able to do is to take the values, the pressures of the gases in this figure, and actually apply them to this diagram right here. So let's take a look at oxygen, for instance. Okay. And let's first find the pressure of oxygen in the alveoli. Where are we going to find that? Well, that's right there. It has a pressure of 104 millimeters of mercury. And then we want to know what the pressure of oxygen is in the pulmonary capillaries. Well, where do we find that? And again, this is the pressure that I want is the pressure of oxygen in the blood that's entering the pulmonary capillaries. So where's the blood entering the pulmonary capillaries? Well, that's this right here. This is the deoxygenated blood that returns to the right side of the heart. Ventricles contract, sends it up the pulmonary arteries and into the pulmonary capillaries where gas exchange is going to occur. So what kind of value do we have for oxygen? We have a value of 40. So which way is oxygen going to move? Oxygen is going to move from an area of higher pressure to lower pressure, which means it's going to move from the alveoli into the capillaries. What about carbon dioxide? What's the pressure of carbon dioxide in the pulmonary capillaries? That's 46. And what about in the alveoli? That's 40. So not a big difference, but a difference nonetheless. Carbon dioxide moves from an area of higher pressure to lower pressure from the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli. Okay. So we're applying a little physics there. We're getting down to the nitty-gritty of why these gases are moving the way they move. And so we have the exchange of those gases. Okay, oxygen moves into the capillaries, CO2 moves into the alveoli, and then the blood coming out of that after that gas exchange occurs is represented right here. This is the concentration of, these are the pressures of the gases that are traveling down the pulmonary veins to the left side of the heart that are going to end up in the systemic circulation. So the next important physiological process that I want to look at here is the transport of these respiratory gases. Okay, how are these gases transported throughout the circulatory system? Now, we're going to look at oxygen and carbon dioxide. And oxygen is a little more straightforward because we've already talked about this, but basically almost 99% of oxygen in the blood is transported by hemoglobin. And specifically, it's going to bind to an iron molecule that's located on that heme group right there. So that's how most of the oxygen is going to be transported through the blood. Carbon dioxide is a little more complicated. And there's a few ways carbon dioxide can travel, but about 70% of that is transported as bicarbonate. And so it travels as bicarbonate in the plasma. And you can see the carbon dioxide in there. Okay, we just added an extra oxygen and an extra hydrogen, and that gives us bicarbonate. But that's how CO2 is going to travel through the blood. And specifically what happens is that when CO2 enters the blood, enters the red blood cells, it combines with oxygen, gets converted to carbonic acid, and that dissociates into bicarbonate into free hydrogen ions. And again, this is how that carbon dioxide is traveling in the blood, is as bicarbonate. Okay? And this equation right here is part of a larger buffer system that we call the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. Here's our carbonic acid, there's our bicarbonate. And this is found in the blood, both in the plasma and the red blood cells. And this buffer system is one of the major ways that we're going to help maintain acid-base balance of the body fluids. And we'll talk about a little bit more about how that happens a little later on. But for now, what I want you guys to know is that carbon dioxide enters into this equation and it eventually gets converted to bicarbonate, and that's how it travels in the blood. So this diagram that we're looking at here is alveolar gas exchange. Here is the alveoli right here. Here's the pulmonary capillary. And this is showing the gases moving across this respiratory membrane, moving from areas of higher pressure to lower pressure. So let's take a look at oxygen first of all. So what happens with oxygen? Here's oxygen, and I think we said the pressure in the alveoli is 104. The pressure in the pulmonary capillaries is 40. That's a large pressure difference. So oxygen moves across this respiratory membrane passively. And what does it do? It enters into the red blood cell here. Once it's into the red blood cell, what does it show oxygen doing there? What oxygen is doing is it's combining with hemoglobin. And this right there, HbO2, represents oxygen O2 bound to hemoglobin. And again, this is where 98.5%, or this is how 98.5% of oxygen travels through the blood, is within the red blood cell bound to this hemoglobin molecule. And the last process that I wanted to look at here is systemic gas exchange. And this occurs, like it says, in the systemic circulation, and it involves the movement of gases between the systemic capillaries and the cells of the body, essentially. And what I want you to be able to do here is to fill in the same gas pressures that are occurring here, kind of like we did earlier. Okay, except now we're talking about at the systemic level. So, for instance, what is the pressure of oxygen in these systemic capillaries right there, entering the systemic capillaries? That's 95. What about in the interstitial fluid here? Where do we look at to find that? Well, here's the pressure of those gases in the tissue fluid. So the pressure of oxygen is 40. So which way is oxygen going to move? Oxygen moves from an area of higher concentration, higher pressure in the capillaries, to an area of lower pressure in the interstitial fluid. And that's why oxygen is being dropped off from the capillaries to the cells of the body. Okay, it's going down its pressure gradient from 95 down to 40 there. Then those cells take in oxygen. What do they do with it? They use it for cellular respiration, generating ATP. A byproduct of that ATP is carbon dioxide that we need to get rid of. And carbon dioxide is going to move from the interstitial fluid into the systemic capillaries here. Now, why does carbon dioxide do that? Well, it does it because it's going down its concentration gradient, its pressure gradient. So what's the pressure of carbon dioxide in the tissue fluid? That's 46 millimeters of mercury. What about in the systemic capillaries? Only 40. So again, not a large difference, but a difference nonetheless. So carbon dioxide is going to move from the fluids around the tissues into the capillaries. All right, so then we have the exchange of those gases there. Oxygen moves to the tissues, carbon dioxide moves to the blood, and those are exchanged until equilibrium is reached. And then the blood coming out of those systemic capillaries is now deoxygenated. We went in with 95 millimeters of oxygen, and we go out with 40 because we dropped a lot of it off. What about for carbon dioxide? We went in with 40 millimeters of mercury, and now we leave with 46 because that's what we picked up. And this is a diagram of the systemic gas exchange right here. And let's just pick back up with oxygen, because oxygen we picked up at the lungs and it combined with hemoglobin, but now we're at the systemic tissues and we want to drop that hemoglobin off. Or sorry, drop that oxygen off. So here's oxygen bound to hemoglobin, and when it gets to the tissues, to the systemic capillaries, hemoglobin dissociates from oxygen. Now we have free oxygen, and oxygen moves from an area of higher pressure to lower pressure, from 95 to 40 millimeters of mercury. And that's great because now the cells have oxygen to use. But what about carbon dioxide? Okay, so we're picking up carbon dioxide. It has a pressure of 46 in the interstitial fluid and 40 inside the blood, so we know it's going to move from the tissue fluid into the blood. But what happens to it when it gets in the blood? Well, all of these arrows show different ways that carbon dioxide is transported through the blood. And the size of the arrow represents how much of that is transported. So what we see here is that a small amount of CO2 goes into the blood and it simply dissolves in the plasma. And that's how it's transported, is dissolved as a gas in the plasma. Here you have a little bit larger amount of CO2 that goes into the red blood cell, and it actually combines with hemoglobin. So some CO2 is bound to hemoglobin, and that's how it travels through the blood. But the majority of it, 70% of the CO2, represented by this large arrow here, enters the blood, goes in a red blood cell, and it enters into this carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. And specifically, it combines with water to be converted to carbonic acid, and then that gets converted to bicarbonate and free hydrogen ions. Then that bicarbonate moves into the plasma, and so 70% of the CO2 traveling in the blood travels as bicarbonate in the plasma. And that's something that you guys need to know. Okay, so this is how 70% of the carbon dioxide is traveling through the blood. Now what happens when we get to the lungs? Because when we get to the lungs, we need to take this carbon dioxide and drop it back off. Well, how does that happen? We'll just go back to this. So when we get to the lungs, what happens is that this bicarbonate moves back into the red blood cell, and it basically goes through this equation in reverse. It combines with hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid. Then that dissociates into water and carbon dioxide. And that allows carbon dioxide to move down its pressure gradient from an area of 46 to 40. Okay, and I expect you guys to be able to put all this together, including how these gases are being transported through the blood.